Hello, I'm Dan Proft. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Against the Current. Today, two everyday experts, one a tech entrepreneur, the other a bankruptcy attorney. So, of course, the topic is religious freedom in the public square. Happy to be joined, coming to you live from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago by Doug Johnson, the aforementioned tech entrepreneur, who also is a director of the Fellowship of St. James, which publishes Touchstone Magazine, and David Christian, who is a bankruptcy attorney and a parishioner in good standing of St. Benedict's in North Center. You'll understand why I call them everyday experts when you hear our discussion about religious freedom in the public square in the year 2015. So let's start right there. The question is, do we still have religious freedom in this country? It seems like a question that would obviously be responded to with a yes, even with the redefinition of marriage and the challenges to religious expression in the public square, in public life. But what is your assessment of the state of religious freedom, and do we continue to have it?
Right. So, I mean, my answer is no. And as you just said, I mean, everybody knows you can go to church, you can go to any church you want, or you don't have to go to any church at all. But, and I look at this, what was the example with, was it Office Depot in Schaumburg?
The flyers.
Right. So why don't you,
Well, so Office Depot flyers. So a woman wants to get some flyers printed at Office Depot to distribute, to advocate for the defunding of Planned Parenthood. The flyer contains data points ripped from the Planned Parenthood annual report, along with a prayer from Father Frank Pavone, the director of Priests for Life. An associate at Office Depot is uncomfortable printing those flyers, so she orders the flyers online. She wants to pick them up at the Schaumburg store in northwest suburban Cook County. The order is canceled by the associate. She doesn't understand why. She calls the corporate office. She finds out that the associate was uncomfortable, so that associate canceled the order unbeknownst to her, because the corporate policy at Office Depot, at least as initially expressed, was our associates don't have to print anything they're uncomfortable with. Subsequent to pressure, including from legal representation of this woman, Maria Goldstein, Office Depot said, we've reviewed the flyer and we agree with Ms. Goldstein that there's nothing hateful. There's no hate speech in that flyer. So if she would like to come back, we'll print those flyers for her. And the question is, would the response have been the same? And oh, by the way, her legal counsel asserts, I think very persuasively, that Office Depot's action is actually a violation of the Cook County Human Rights Ordinance, which prohibits discrimination, even by a private entity, against people based on their faith or their religious tradition. But so the question is, what would the response have been publicly and legally had the associate decided that he or she was uncomfortable printing flyers that advertised the gay pride parade?
Yeah, and it's more than just, say, just a double standard. Because everybody who hears this story, we know, well, you read the story and you say, oh, gee, yeah, no big surprise, I'm for it or I'm against it. If it was reverse, and somebody came in and said, I want to print flyers for, let's say, my marriage to my male partner, and it was refused, everybody would fully expect that there would be firings, and possibly very high up at Office Depot. So why is this? What's going on? Why do we have this knee-jerk reaction? And at the level of the Supreme Court, but also just in general. Culturally, we seem to have gotten to this point where we say, religious freedom is this thing that you do privately in your head. You can go into any church you want and close the doors, and as long as nobody hears you and doesn't get out, that's fine. We don't care what you do. But if you're going to practice your faith in public, at work, or you're going to do it with others, then that's where we got to draw a line. Now that makes Christianity basically an impossibility. I mean, I hope I'm remembering the verse right, but I think it might be Matthew 18:20, but if I'm wrong, it doesn't matter. But Christ says, wherever 3 or 4 of you, or 2 or 3 of you are gathered in my name, I will be there in the midst of you. It doesn't mean that Christ isn't there when you are by yourself, but the point is it is all about, Christian worship is all about this collective thing we do. We don't do it for an hour on Sunday, but rather every waking moment of our lives. And so I think where we've gotten...
And you do it in fellowship with other people.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. It's why in Roman Catholicism, the central act of worship is gathering together and having communion. It is meant to be done jointly, and it's the way it's always been done. When the first Christian communities met, they met sometimes in small groups. They were sometimes required to meet secretly. Perhaps they will one day again with the direction that we're headed, but it was always a community of people, of believers. And moreover, that community was charged with enlarging the community of believers. But evangelizing, the Pentecost. But what Doug is suggesting, I think correctly, is that there is now a cultural force in this country, and really throughout the Western world, and has been for some time, that seeks to affirmatively resist that aspect of Christianity, and perhaps of other evangelizing religions as well. It might be helpful to take a step back and think about what we mean by religious liberty, because I think the conception that the three of us around this table may have is different than many Americans. And it's why many Americans could easily answer your question, Dan, about do we have religious liberty by saying, yes, of course, we're the freest country the earth has ever known. And in many ways...
And because people, in the abstract sense, say, well, of course I believe in religious liberty in a pluralistic society,
right.
a free society like
They give
America.
themselves credit for believing in it,
Right.
and they give the country credit for providing it. And in some ways, they're correct. But religious liberty, I think properly conceived, is different in kind than the freedom to go on Sunday or Saturday to any church of your choosing and to do that privately in your own home. The way our founders conceived our religious liberty was part of building a community that could thrive and to be protective of society, of families, and of the individuals. And I think it's helpful to consider why many of our forefathers came here in the first place. Whether you talk about the colony in Maryland, which was a safe haven for Catholics, or the Quakers in Pennsylvania, or you talk about those coming over on the Mayflower and thereafter to the Massachusetts Bay Colony with their Puritan faith, or you fast forward a number of generations and you talk about the Roman Catholics of Irish and Italian and other ethnic descent who came to the United States in waves. They came here not to be free from religion, but to be free to practice their religion.
Right, but so the pushback is going to be, well, where do you draw these lines? Because everybody should be able to practice their faith as they see fit, so long as it doesn't infringe upon my rights, or you're not, as the saying goes, forcing your views, forcing your values on me. And so this is where we've become obsessed to some extent, particularly politically, well, I guess culturally and then politically, because politics follows the culture, with drawing those lines. So how do you draw those lines?
Well, and this is where a neat little twist comes in. So the way it's sold as is that, those Christians or the Catholics or the various evangelical groups, we got to stop them from imposing their beliefs on you. Mm-hmm. And what we don't pick up on is there is no absent. Everybody makes a metaphysical choice. And when someone says, you know what, you stand alone, that you're this autonomous individual, all choices are yours, you're not in the grip of the family, you're not in the grip of your church, first and foremost, you're an independent. Everybody likes that idea because even all of us, to a certain extent, we say, yeah, no, don't want anyone telling me what I can do. And this is how it's sold. But this was a really recent invention. And what's ironic, mostly was invented by John Stuart Mill on Liberty. And John Stuart Mill is, by today's standards, very much kind of a statist totalitarian. He said we'd have this elite group, and we're going to say what everybody should be taught. His father, James Mill, hated Christianity. He was an atheist, and very much wanted to say how we wanted to kind of structure society and get this idea out of people's heads. Well, one of the ways you do that is you say, wait a minute, let's say the individual has his own autonomy, and anybody that says anything otherwise is a threat to him personally. And now, Mill had a name for it. He called it the religion of humanity, and this is the religion that he wanted to impose on our country as a whole. But what's really smart about the people who oppose, what I would say oppose religious freedom today, is they never call it a religion. They just say, well, that's what we think. Well, it's not what we think. And it's not...
But when you say it's not what we think, who's the we?
Well, what I mean is this, you know what, a really easy way to think of it. I was like muddling this over, and it does get, I actually ended up, I traced it, I looked at Mill, and I said, okay, what does Descartes say, and where did all this start, and blah, blah, blah. A really easy way to think of it is go back to Genesis. In the 3rd chapter, 1st verse, the devil asks something that he knows the answer to. He says, did God say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Well, he knows, somehow he knows what God said. He knows God didn't say that. Eve obviously knows God didn't say that. No one's even talking about that. So why has he asked this question? And she says, no, he didn't say that. He just said we couldn't eat from this particular tree. And that's verse 2. And so what happens is he puts the idea in her head, well, wouldn't it be awful if you couldn't eat from anything because you love this garden? But it'd be bad. It puts the idea in her head, it would be a bad thing if I couldn't eat from all these trees. And then the next question, when she says, no, it's just this one tree, the devil's, or the serpent's, the same thing, but the serpent's mission is accomplished. He's got her to look at what's the difference between whether it's one tree or all the trees. The point is God's will against your will. And this is in contrast to a God, this is in the Judeo-Christian tradition, how it appears in Scripture, is a God that created us out of love. And everything is provided to us. Love is not some sentimental Hallmark card, but it is rather the creative force behind everything in the universe. And when we start talking about, well, do you get all the trees? No, it's just one that's taken away from us. Suddenly, it's not like, really, God's warning is like a parent saying to a child, don't put your hand in the fire. And the serpent has got him to look at that as something that's been taken away from you, arbitrarily, by force of will. And I think that was really the first religious question.
Yeah, but it's just the autonomy question, for example. So say this is a relatively recent invention, the idea that autonomy is the greatest good. Well, maybe that is evolution. Maybe that is representative of progressive thinking, that we have come to the idea that somebody can hold the idea that being the autonomous being is the ultimate good, and why can't that coexist with somebody who wants to engage in the fellowship of worship?
What we started with is your question, is there religious liberty today, culturally, politically, in our system and in our society? And the question you just asked perhaps gets us toward an answer to that question in the following way. Let's assume we could get to the autonomy that some hold up as a virtue. It necessarily, perhaps ironically, guarantees that there will not be liberty. And here's why.
Wait, say that again?
Getting autonomy, individual autonomy, without the constraints put on it by church or family or traditional rules, necessarily leads to a lack of liberty in the following, again, perhaps
so
ironic sense.
I just want to understand that what you're arguing, or you're about to argue, maximum autonomy without constraints, is anti-liberty.
Right. So who is going to assure my right to have an abortion whenever I want one? Who is going to assure my right to marry whomever I want, of whatever gender, and perhaps in whatever numbers? Who is going to assure that I'm not forced to print something in my workplace I find uncomfortable? Who will make sure for me that I'm not going to be confronted with something that makes me uncomfortable or goes against my personal quest for who I can be in the universe?
The state.
The state.
Right.
It means the state will be all-powerful. And we've seen this throughout history with governments that disdained the individual, disdained liberty, from the Roman Empire to the fascism, socialism, and Marxism of Europe. The state aggregates to itself all power, always with the intention of preserving what's best for all the people that inhabit it. And a further point that I know Doug has made in the past, and perhaps it's not even a further point, it's part and parcel of the point, that if an individual is looking to the government for his autonomy, that individual can never withstand the force of that government, while a church might be able to, while a community might be able to. St. Thomas More is at least attributed with a speech where he said, when all the trees are cut down, what's going to hold us up against the force of wind brought on by the devil? And we're cutting down those trees in society today.
So the question that somebody's going to ask who doesn't share your faith tradition is, well, how can a Richard Dawkins exist among the faithful in a free society?
Right, because what we don't realize is that God gave us religious freedom in the terms of free will. He gave us, for whatever reason, we don't quite know why, the ability to say no and turn away from him. And so Christianity invented religious freedom. Well, Christianity and the Jewish tradition invented religious freedom. They said, you can say no. Obviously, the devil himself said no. And Eve turned away from God and Adam and Eve both by eating from the tree of knowledge. But in the Enlightenment, they said, no, wait a minute. They tried to say this was the beginning of religious freedom. Actually, that was the beginning of the end of it. Because they're saying, no, it's not God that gave you this freedom to say no. It's us. It's the state that is the savior state. And there's a great article in Touchstone Magazine some years ago called The Audacity of the State. And the way
audacity is a favorite word of the last 6 years.
Yeah. And to sum it up, basically the state is saying, look, we want to give you this power, kind of like the serpent in the garden. We want to give you this power to say no, but the power to say no came from God. But if we can get you thinking that you're an autonomous individual and that God is this competing power against you, then you've got not only are you on guard against the church, you're on guard against faith. Well, it's only in the Jewish Christian tradition that says to Richard Dawkins, you can say no. You can do what you want. But in this new authority where our freedom supposedly is granted to us from the state, we don't have that freedom anymore. If we say, no, I want to be able to practice my religion, I want to be able to worship at my church, I want to say a prayer with a group of people, or not do things that are a threat to my conscience, then suddenly the state now is going to step in. They're going to say, no, on behalf of all these people, the rest of the country who stands autonomous, we just can't abide by that anymore.
And let's take some recent examples of what it means to practice your faith for many of us. It used to be that unwanted children were placed for adoption by the Catholic Church in Chicago, but that's not allowed anymore.
Don't I know it?
Right.
Yes.
You know it.
I was unwanted.
Yes.
And
some of us still are.
Thankfully, my parents, I was adopted. Yes.
Yeah, 100% correct. The same is true of my mother in St. Louis. And many of us would not be here but for loving families who took us in through the auspices of the Catholic Church. But in Chicago, that's not allowed because the church teaches that they won't provide for adoption children into families that are made up of same-sex couples. It's a central teaching of the church. And yet, we've done away with that great good. Now, why is that important? Because the practice of the faith is not something we do in the privacy of our own homes alone. It's something we do that engages with the rest of the community.
But I want to stick with this idea of autonomy. And I note this because California recently became the 5th state to pass an assisted suicide law. And it's sold in part by saying, look, this is a restraint on the state. So your life is your own. And if you want to enlist a medical professional to help you meet your maker because you have a terminal illness or because you're tired of being here, then that's your right because it's your life. And what people hear persons of faith saying who don't believe in suicide, much less assisted suicide, with a medical professional ostensibly violating his or her Hippocratic oath, is, well, wait a second, you're saying that you're going to make choices for how my life ends. And the state is saying, no, we're going to restrain all those people telling you how to live or how to exit and let you chart your own course.
Let's test that premise.
What's wrong with that kind of autonomy?
Let's test that premise. Is your life really just your own? And I don't believe even many progressives would adopt that as a firm rule.
Don't you think they would?
No, because not when it suits their interests, and here's why. When they talk about the duty of those who are more fortunate to pay more taxes, let's say, or when they talk about the duty of fathers and mothers to their children, when they talk about it taking a village, right, a phrase we've heard too much from some, they are rejecting the premise that your life is always just your own, right? And so it's being deployed in this idea of ultimate individual autonomy that Doug is speaking about. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, for good reasons, bad reasons, or no reasons at all. And that's a premise that I think many of us reject, and I think our founding fathers would reject it, and the Western tradition would reject it. When have we had a successful society that operated on that premise?
Yeah, but maybe this is, as I said before, this is kind of arguably
evolving.
Well, right, along the lines of the most recent moment in time is the most advanced.
Right. There was a really somebody watching this most people don't go to church. Let's face it, something like 65% of people don't go to church every week. And they're not going to be listening to this and I don't really care about that. That's fine, I hear what they're saying, but it doesn't really apply to me. Some years ago, Theodore Dalrymple, his real name's Anthony Daniels, but the writer Theodore Dalrymple sat down with a Dutch journalist. This has nothing to do with the church. In fact, he's a non-believer himself. And
he's a doctor, medical doctor.
Yeah. Brilliant writer, but this article, and it was in City Journal, he sat down with a Dutch journalist who wanted to interview him about all his writing, and the guy was dressed like we're dressed now, and he spoke with an Eton accent, very well educated, and so on and so forth. And the subject of tattoos came up, and he says, well, the journalist said that they're legal, so what more is there to say about it? And there was 2 points Daniels made about it. He goes, one, here was a guy who didn't value the things he valued. He was dressed well. He thought people should have certain manners. He's incredibly well-mannered, very well-spoken, very well-educated. But he said, it's legal. He shrugged his shoulders to it. And he goes, what has he done? He's just unwittingly put politicians as the arbiters of all morality in his life. And he goes, nobody really wants that. No one wants to sit back and say, Chuck Schumer decides what's right and wrong in my life. It's nonsense. But what is the authority? What Archbishop, you guys know how to pronounce his last name?
Supich.
No, Charles Chaput. Chaput, is that how I pronounce the last name? He said, when you remove the church from the public square, you remove the only authority higher than political authority. And that is exactly what this Dutch journalist did in this discussion of tattoos. He said, it's legal. There's nothing more to be said.
Well, so this seems to be like a cultural problem and a religious problem maybe as well. But so this is what Charles Murray describes as the educated, the well-off, not preaching what they practice. So they practice staying married, raising children. They practice decorum, societal norms as we have come to understand them over the last 2,000 years. But that's not what they preach. So why, if it's successful for them, don't we have more people who know better preaching what they practice?
So 2 points. One, I think we know the surface answer of why some people practice differently than they preach, right? And the answer is they want to be free to do what they want when they want.
Yeah.
Right? So just selfishly.
Yeah, but that's not the people that are behaving like you're describing. They should behave.
They are successful people,
right?
Who have behaved differently because they have the maturity, wisdom. Maybe they've been taught by their families in a way that's going to lead them to greater rewards later.
Right.
So,
It doesn't matter if
yeah, but so
they're-
why wouldn't they preach the successful model they practice?
Because they want to be free
But they are
to do what they
preaching the
want.
sex. But it just happens that it coincides. In other words, I really liked studying really hard and going to, Amherst College
Yeah, right.
and making a lot of money, and I'm going to pass that on to my children because it's what I want to do. Now, somebody else might say, I really like heroin.
And here's the important point. For every one of those individuals who has the maturity, can accept delayed gratification, has developed whatever Aristotelian habits lead them to be successful and be the subject of Murray's analysis, there are others who don't make those wise choices.
I know, but
right?
but that's not the answer to my question.
But here's my question back to you. What kind of society will we have if more and more people are free to do more and more of the time, more and more of whatever they want?
Well,
we're going to have fewer of those individuals who are accepting delayed gratification and
Right.
being responsible toward their families.
That's what we have now.
And
that's what we've had over the last 40 years.
And we're going to have more of it.
But it still doesn't answer the question, why do those people who know what the successful model is, who practice the successful model, why don't they say this is a successful model that should be followed?
What the problem is in your premise there is they don't know what the successful model is.
They're living it.
No, they aren't.
Okay. Why is that? How is that?
For instance, I had a
Delayed gratification, education,
No, they're living-
financial
they're-
self-sufficiency.
Right. And what you just described is a materialist model.
Right.
And a purely materialist model is a train wreck in the long run. It just so happens that we like hard work so we can have a lot of money. This goes back to like Plato's forms. Why do I want to get the raccoon coat, to take Anthony Esselin's way of describing it? Well, so I can get this girl. And okay, why do I want money? So I can get this coat. Why do I want to get this coat? Well, this girl will like me. Why do you want that? So I can be married to her. Why do you want to be married? So I can be happy. That's the end point. You don't say, I want to be happy so I can have more money. So there is this happiness then is kind of an ineffable thing. It is not, and it has no connection with materialism. And what I was at a lunch here, a couple of years ago, I'll never forget it. Everyone was sitting around, a very libertarian group, and someone told the story about a man who cornered, again, he got the XXX domain name from the internet, and he went to court for a number of years, and he came out with tens of millions of dollars. And everybody was kind of falling over themselves to say, excuse me, power to him. Yeah, to put out their bona fides that we're libertarians, we don't care as long as you work hard and you can have this XXX domain, and that's a good thing. But no one raised the point that basically enslaving women on to bear our daughters or our mothers or whatever
We're not supposed to celebrate pornography.
Yeah, that
and
should be put
profiting from
aside.
pornography.
What they're arguing is that what's good here is we don't care about that. We don't care what you do. And, we do care. So I guess my answer to your question is, what I'm trying to think of is, my answer to your question is they're not preaching the right model. And what they're preaching is materialism, and it's only technically different from what Marx was talking about. Marx was preaching materialism.
Well, what about it, just going back to the assisted suicide law, because that has some popularity because it has a certain appeal that, gosh, nobody wants to suffer or see a loved one suffer from ALS or some debilitating disease. So the idea that they should be able to call their end, just let me finish, has great appeal. And so forget materialism for a second, because this isn't materialism, I don't think.
Well, it is.
Well, okay, well, you can reply in kind then. What about the idea that I should have the self-determination to avoid suffering? What's wrong with that?
Well, there are many responses, but I think the most important, or at least the first one, is that this autonomy to dispose of your life is a pernicious idea about life and its value. I mean, once we start saying that some life is more valuable than other life, and we're going to rank them.
What it's the individual saying my life pre-ALS is more valuable than my life with ALS, and forget everyone else. I'm not talking about everyone else. I'm just talking about me.
And there's no way I can talk you out of that. If that's your position,
Right.
there's no way I can talk you out of it. The only way, And it doesn't make there's no sensible way to talk you out of that. But there is one example. I mean, after all, the faith that we're talking about, primarily in this country, is Christianity. So this is a faith born around a man who died in a moment of expiatory pain and great suffering. And this is the pathway. That's the explanation. But if no one believes that, they're like, well, it's fine if you believe it. Then there is no explanation. There is no way out.
Let me suggest an explanation too, in addition to that, a temporal one, which is the experience of other countries that have pursued this path just on this particular issue, because I think it's instructive. The idea is, it's kind of what David Mamet refers to in his book, The Secret Knowledge. I hate to ruin the ending for you, but the secret knowledge is there is no secret knowledge, right? Nobody has a secret knowledge. And so for you to say that we can limit, because this is always what it's about, it's just going to be for this specific case. But with human beings involved, it's never that specific case. So for example, the experience in Belgium with assisted suicide is assisted suicide for someone with anorexia, someone who
was depressed,
yes, over a failed romance, yes, persons with developmental disabilities. So the idea that
even children now,
right? So the idea that this is just here's where I want to draw the line. It's very much like, and we'll get into this, like the redefinition of marriage.
Yes.
I'm going to draw the line here,
yes,
and this is the line, and everything else. Oh, that's ridiculous. I disagree with that. But the problem is, you don't get to draw that line. Once you've opened the door, you can close it.
That's why I say it's pernicious, because you take a case where everybody'd be like, well, man, that's a tough case. I mean, even the rules that exist in my life and my beliefs, man, somebody who's really suffering and has no prognosis for any better life in the future, and maybe they're done raising their children, their parents are already deceased, they're not going to be letting anybody down. I mean, you can find a case at the extreme end of the spectrum. I'm still going to tell you that is a life, and I'm going to tell you, based on my faith tradition, that whether it's through intercessory prayer or God's will, that a different outcome is possible.
Or even in a secular sense. I mean, just again, sticking on this for illustrative purposes, what's the movie, The Butterfly and the Diving Bell? Did you see that movie? So this is a movie about an editor of a popular fashion magazine who has a stroke, and he has locked-in syndrome, and he's in his 40s, and all he can do is blink with I think it was his left eye, right? So he's locked in, he's trapped in his own body. It is unrecoverable. It is catastrophic, and so this would be, to me, the perfect quintessential example of, well, this is where assisted suicide or something humane is a legitimate course of action. And it turns out that through the course of that struggle to try and recover, that through working with the medical personnel that were tending to him, he writes a book, Blinking, right, to share his experience and how inspirational his ability to write that book by blinking as the nurse is going back and forth on an alphabet board trying to decipher the words he's trying to communicate.
So one thing,
right, and so I mean, so that's like the extreme example, and that yet still at a secular level, he could add value to the human experience.
So let's assume nobody's engaged in intercessory prayer for this extreme case.
Right.
Let's say God's will is that this person not recover. And so even if you accept that extreme possibility of saving this person's physical well-being is not going to happen, there's still something there, it turns out, that may be more valuable than the lives of millions of the rest of us who are trudging along seeking materialistic satisfaction. But the sort of point I would make to somebody who doesn't share that faith tradition is that once you start drawing those lines, two things happen. They get drawn in ever more benign cases. You gave the example of the depressed person, the anorexic person, things that can be fixed, people whose lives can get better. And we have to turn to the state and its power to enforce that right.
Oh, yeah, and there's one more point there. I don't want to dovetail, because let's say this guy didn't write a book. He's just in there. People think, I've talked to a doctor here in Chicago, and she talks about going into, she's a very left-wing woman, And she just says she's so disgusted when she goes into these wards where people are not necessarily in that state, but according to her, their lives are a waste now. They're nothing.
Right.
So what happens is, so what we have now, we've developed it with this idea, when you take religion out of the picture, suffering itself becomes an outrage. Anybody has to suffer anything. It's like this, why should someone have to suffer this? And then what happens is, and this goes to your point, is take our man with locked-in syndrome, who isn't writing a book, who's just sitting there. The state, out of just its own mercy, makes the decision for him. And this is why 20% of people in Belgium are now being killed by doctor-assisted suicide.
You have the example
although it's turning out that it's not suicide.
You have the example of the daughter who finds out that her mother has been euthanized based on the doctor's decision without telling the daughter that her mother would be dead.
Well, that's right. But we always remind people as conservatives that the state is not some kind of intergalactic body of superhumans. It's just a bunch of human beings that have a monopoly of force in society.
Yeah. Not even the best of us.
Well, that's arguable, right? So the question is, I mean, you use the term, and probably sarcastically, the idea that the state can demonstrate mercy. Does the state have the capacity for mercy?
It certainly thinks it does, right?
Right. Well, that's how it argues. Everything the state does is out of compassion.
Well,
arguably, I mean, in terms of the marketing of it, let's say the state legitimately does it.
So let's say the state is trying, as the state conceives it, through the acts of these individual politicians and bureaucrats who may or may not be the best we have to offer. Let's say the state is attempting to offer its idea of good for its citizens. Well, first of all, I think the broad scope of human history demonstrates that doesn't generally work out very well. But people will tell you that these examples we would give, whether it's about the extent to which euthanasia would be used on people who aren't really in a state of impossibility, or the extent to which a gay marriage ruling turns into something else, is some far-off, extreme example, and we can draw lines before we ever get to those slippery slopes. It turns out, and the two examples we've talked about, the euthanasia example and the marriage redefinition example, illustrate this perfectly. It turns out those slippery slopes are slid down very quickly. It was 10 years to the day between when Justice Scalia predicted the redefinition of marriage and when the Supreme Court of the United States did it. It was hours or days, at most weeks, before somebody filed a lawsuit in the wake of the marriage redefinition ruling seeking a ruling to protect their polygamous marriages. So those supposedly far off or impossible slippery slopes are actually right at our feet. Or we're already sliding down them.
What do you guys?
Let me just. So the question though is if that's true, and if the state is merciless, effectively, we can't avoid these slippery slopes, and we don't have religious freedom at present in the real substantive sense of that phrase, then what should persons of faith do? Because there's a real argument going on among people who generally agree with what you're saying in terms of whether Christians and other persons of faith, not limited to Christianity, but other persons of faith, who also believe in peaceful pluralism, should we fight or should we flee and kind of get back to base camp, reconstitute ourselves, and represent at some point where the public arena is more amenable to persons of faith?
Well, each case, of course, presents its own factors that have to be considered. The county clerk in Kentucky who's taken a particular oath and has a particular job description faces some complications that Doug and I don't face in making those decisions. But we can look to history, to church fathers, to the saints for illustration. And one that I turn to just as a starting place in a lot of these discussions is St. Justin Martyr, who lived in and around Rome during a period before Rome became a Christian empire. And so he was a minority. He was persecuted. Ultimately, St. Justin Martyr was martyred for his faith. Yes. And so he wrote an open letter to the emperor basically defending his small, oppressed Christian community in the political context of the Roman Empire of the early centuries after Christ. And basically, and I'm not going to do it justice, but basically what he says is, look, don't persecute us. We're good citizens, we pay our taxes, we don't kill people, we're good guys to have around. Now, where did he draw some lines? Well, there's apparently a practice in ancient Rome where an unwanted baby could be put through a door and left, abandoned, and there were, I guess, the equivalent of orphanages that would take that baby and care for it in some cases.
We do that now. You can leave a baby at a fire station.
We do that now. That's 100% correct, and it's telling, not in a good way. But the point is, St. Justin Martyr drew some lines. We don't want babies left to their death. We're not going to kill people, and we don't condone the destruction of what God's created. But basically, we're good citizens. We pay our taxes. Now, what ultimately happened to him was that he was martyred. And why was that? I mean, I don't obviously know what was in the heads of his executioners or in the head of the Roman emperor, but I can guess at it. And the answer is, the scariest thing to a state with that kind of power, or that kind of perceived power, was someone who said, I don't care if you kill me, I won't change my mind.
So does that mean we should be the unnamed man in front of the Chinese tanks in Tiananmen Square? Is that where it's at?
This is Ron Dreher has written a lot about this. He calls it the Benedict option. And it's like, well, let's look at where we are as Christians and just say this. Look, we're screwed. So let's just retreat from society. If I understand how he's described it.
That's right.
And do the best we can in our little. There's some merit to talking about it that way. And if I were in a position, if I were a priest and I had a flock of people, I'd want to do whatever I could to protect them. However, we're going to lose. And we might, if you look at the Christians in the Bible didn't have it very good. All of the disciples were killed, except for, I think, St. John. Isn't that right? He lived, regardless. The point is that I think where we're at is we have to stand up. And we talked about this a little while ago, where my priest, Father Pat, was saying how in the South where he grew up.
This is in All Saints in Chicago.
Yeah. And he said, well, why grew up? Because you would start off a Baptist, made a little money for yourself, got your business going, you'd be a Methodist, and then when things were really well, you joined the Episcopal Church. So again, the Christian church was just seemed like this pathway to, you wanted to be on city council, and you wanted to be...
According to where you were professionally.
Well, that has nothing to do with Christianity.
Well,
and it's a nice society that everybody has a common understanding of certain things that they're getting from church, and there's a lot of good about that. But at the same time, there's a lot of bad going on too. And if we were doing everything right, and we are going to stand by, we're going to pick up our own cross. Well, picking up your own cross means things could get pretty ugly. And that's not such a bad thing. So it's not necessarily bad news that we're going to be martyred.
You're suggesting run into Panzer fire knowing you're going to be shot down.
I don't know if I put in necessarily Panzer fire, but if you want to use that analogy, yeah, that's basically what I'm saying.
Another way to make the point is that if things are going well for the church,
always getting targeted.
Right.
If things are going well,
Godwin's law here.
If things are going well for the church and for its adherents, that may be a bad sign about the state of the church, and that's true in lots of different contexts. When the kingdoms of Europe had become so wedded to the church that they were one and the same, and everything was comfortable for the bishops and the nobility alike. That wasn't a healthy thing for the church.
Well, right, and I have to say one of my favorite quotes from St. Bernard. He said, church is in the best position, because the church is in the best position when it's under attack from all sides, and it's under the worst position when it's most at peace. And this is what he was talking about.
Because how is it
no good reason for us to be at peace with the state.
Yeah, but the flip side of that is what's happening. I mean, David, you're Roman Catholic, I'm Roman Catholic. It seems to some, especially conservative Roman Catholics, that Pope Francis is ceding ground to cultural forces that do not extol the tenets of Roman Catholicism. So if the Pope is ceding ground, what is left to the faithful to do?
Well, let me make this point. There have been a lot of popes in history that have ceded a lot more ground. Julius II leading troops into battle to reclaim the papal states.
The warrior pope.
About whom Erasmus said, he's a great man, but there's no evidence he's a Christian. We've been through this before.
Right.
We've been through a melding of the church and the state. We've been through in human history multiple times when going to church is more of a social function and more about your standing in society than it is about witnessing the Christian faith.
But also to be clear, I just want to be clear on this because this is an argument that's advanced by the left all the time. You talk about a melding of the church and state. That's a bad thing. I just want to be clear that this is no advocacy for some kind of Catholic theocracy.
No. In fact, the opposite.
Right.
When Henry VIII was the defender of the faith, that didn't work out so well for English Catholics. And Queen Elizabeth II still wears the title today, Defender of the Faith. And yet she heads a church that is the same as the state. And what is the state of English Christianity? It's farther along on the pathway we're worried about than the United States is.
Yeah, and this is a great point. Repeat your point you were just saying about.
The idea that is advanced, it goes back to kind of what we were talking about before. Well, you're just trying to impose your values on me. You want to blur the distinction between the church and the state. You want, to the extremist rhetoric, you want to impose some kind of Catholic or Christian theocracy. And that's the last thing I want to do. The last thing I want to do is meld religion and the state.
I want you to accept Christianity on your own. And importantly, for the point you're making, Dan, the Second Vatican Council expressly teaches that.
Well,
let me go back.
But people say, the left is always separation of church and state. If you express any religiosity, wait, what about separation of church and state? And I understand it's a misinterpretation of the Establishment Clause, but I want to make it clear that people of faith, that's the last, with the exception of maybe some Islamic theocracies in North Africa and the Middle East, people of faith, that's the last thing we want to do is get the state involved in the administration of our faith.
It's not only the last thing we want to do is what is specifically. Again, this idea of religious freedom came from within the Christian tradition.
Right, and it's the left that wants the state involved in how religion is practiced. It's the left
to constrict it.
Yes. But anyway, getting back to your point you're making earlier, and we all do this. We sit down and we think, well, what do we want? Like, what's the best way we could fix things? What would be this ideal state where we can practice our religion the way we want? And things aren't going on the trajectory they're going now. The answer is there isn't this ideal state. I like what C.S. Lewis said about democracy. What we forget in these discussions is that people are bad. We are all fallen.
We're all fallen, yes.
And C.S. Lewis said, if democracy is good because everybody's got their right, they got to vote and they've got to say, and I'm as good as the next guy. He goes, that's the deal, that's what's being sold, I don't want anything to do with it. Which is kind of little, people are like, wait, what does that mean?
Well, so then,
what he's saying is, what Lewis's point is, no, democracy is good, is because all these people that are fallen and bad, the more people that are in that mix, the less chances there's one particular group is going to get control.
But square that with what John Adams said about the Constitution, that it was written for a holy, faithful people, and it's insufficient for anything less.
Right. And that's a point to echo by that is by a contemporary of Francis Grund. He said, if you change the religious outlook of Americans, and this was written in 1837, he said, if you change the religious outlook of Americans, you don't have to change one word of their Constitution or their Bill of Rights or anything to change their government utterly. And I think what he's talking about is that you have to have this understanding that we are all fallen, that the state can't step in and engineer
to
fix every problem. We shouldn't be trying to remove suffering. The state should not play that role. We as individuals should play that role. I should try and help out you or the poor on the streets. But the last thing I should do is turn to the state to take over control of what I really should be doing for myself.
So here's where individual liberty properly understood is different than personal autonomy to do whatever you want, whenever you want. And that is, we each have an individual obligation to help the sick and the poor. We each have an individual obligation to help our fellow man. We each have an individual obligation to support our families, our brothers and our sisters. And that's what gives us good government. That's what John Adams was talking about in terms of our system working only with a religious people. Because if we don't have that, whether you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God and rose from the dead or not, unless you have the idea that I have a duty that is beyond my personal autonomy to do whatever I want whenever I want, the system doesn't work. Our schools don't work, our communities don't work, our families are dysfunctional, and the United States government will not work without that.
So what's the question that every individual should ask themselves? And maybe they've lived the unexamined life. They haven't asked themselves this. To me, it seems like the fundamental question that everyone has to ask, and there are implications all the way down the line in both directions, depending on how you answer this question, is: do you believe in God, or do you believe you're your own God?
Right.
Is that the fundamental question, or is there another one?
I think that is the fundamental question.
That's it.
And that gets to what Whittaker Chambers said about, boiled down the difference between us and Whittaker Chambers, that people don't know, was a communist spy in the 1930s who eventually outed Alger Hiss, and he became a Christian. And he said, the crisis of the Soviet Union is the extent that it has failed to free the people that it rules from a belief in God. And he said, the crisis of the West exists to the extent that its people are indifferent to God. And that's where we are. There is no, and that, so I think that gets right to your fundamental question. We're saying the same thing.
And Whittaker Chambers is a good place to leave the discussion. Doug Johnson, tech entrepreneur. David Christian, bankruptcy attorney. Everyday experts on faith in the public square. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Against the Current. Appreciate it.
Thank you for
Thank
having us.
you.